Hi there. This presentation will explain how to develop your personal training plan to qualify for the UCI Granfondo World Championships at the Granfondo Vosges on May the 19th, 2025. It's intended for cyclists who are already fairly close to the required level. If you're an experienced cyclist, you train for a minimum of 8 hours per week, and you finish regularly in the top half of your age category at Granfondos, this presentation is for you. It's the first of a series of 3 evening sessions intended to help you qualify for the Granfondo World Championships. This first presentation is about guidelines for your personal training plan and will especially focus on the period from now until mid-February, 15 weeks before the event. It will last 30 to 40 minutes. Please note that last year I did a deep dive on fat oxidation and nutrition, which I'm not going to repeat this year. The video is in our YouTube channel, and I'll give you the exact reference in a few minutes. The remaining 2 presentations are on March the 3rd, when I'll present part 2 of the training plan, and finally on May the 6th, when I'll present how to get your best result on the day. Okay, so let's talk about the event. We'll begin by taking a quick look at the profile. The Granfondo is the qualifying event for men aged 19 to 59. All women and men aged 60 plus need to ride the Mediofondo to qualify, which I'll show you in a minute. The Granfondo was 171 kilometers long in 2024. It included 3,555 meters of climbing over a total of 10 climbs of 5 kilometers or more, and at least 4 or 5 shorter ones. Some of the gradients approached 10% for 2 or 3 kilometers, although most were in the 6 to 8% range. The roads were often narrow, and some of the descents were technical. About 23 kilometers could be described as relatively flat in 3 sections after kilometer 22, 70, and 95. The final 60 kilometers were relentlessly up and down. There may be some small changes coming in 2025, but the profile isn't going to change much. The Mediofondo, which is the qualifying distance for all women and for men aged 60 plus, is 51, I think, kilometers shorter at 119 kilometers. In 2024, it included 2,575 meters of climbing over 5 climbs of 5 kilometers or more and 4 shorter ones. A good part of the route was shared with the Granfondo. So, as already mentioned, the roads were often narrow, the descents technical, and gradients were mostly in the 6 to 8% range, but sometimes approached 10% for 2 or 3 kilometers. About 20k was relatively flat in 3 sections after kilometer 22, 64, and 76. The final 40 kilometers of the Mediofondo were relentlessly up and down, as for the Granfondo. So what does it take to do well on a parcours like that? You can't develop an effective training plan until you understand the characteristics of the people who will do well at this event, or in coaching jargon, the event demands. There are 4 groups of demands. First, the physiological demands. As for any endurance event, the most important demand is for excellent aerobic endurance. Next, durability, which is the ability to repeat successive 20 to 30-minute climbs at threshold or close to it without losing power. Durability is particularly important at the Granfondo Vosges due to the numerous climbs. Almost equally important is excellent short-term muscular endurance, which you need for the short, hard, above-threshold efforts to place well before climbs, bottlenecks, and intersections when you're in the peloton. Next, a high power-to-weight ratio because of all the climbing, fairly obvious. And finally, the ability to recover quickly between efforts. Here are the psychological demands. First is the ability to maintain your focus, motivation, and lucidity for the time it takes to finish, even when you're severely fatigued. Next, the self-discipline to stick to your maximum sustainable pace on the climbs, and if necessary, let others go, perhaps to see them again later. Next, the ability to tolerate long periods of discomfort or even pain. And finally, the ability to stay positive and deal with setbacks and negative thoughts if they come to you during the event. Technical demands: excellent energy-efficient climbing skills on varied gradients, excellent descending and cornering skills, excellent bunch riding skills, and finally, the ability to fuel the ride, to eat and drink at opportune moments during the race. And last of all, the tactical demands These are particularly important if you want to qualify for the Worlds because you need to be in the first quarter of your category and competition is tough. The two most important are the ability to identify which wheels to follow and which ones to let go. And the second is the ability to identify when to move to the front of the group in order to avoid splits and crashes. Now, coming to your personal training plan. The thing is, every single one of these cyclists is unique. They may all have the same objective of qualifying for the Worlds, but they all have different experiences, skills, and constraints. So a generic plan will be suboptimal at best and could even be damaging. This is why I'm not providing a generic plan. The plan, between inverted commas, we propose is in fact a framework and a set of guidelines for you to adapt for yourself. Our goal is to give you the means to think carefully about the process and take responsibility for your own preparation. Inevitably, some of what I say will not be appropriate for you because I don't know your exact situation. So let's take a look at the general principles. The first and most important one, if you want to qualify, you're going to have to make it a priority, not only in your training, but also at least to some extent in your life for the next 5 months or so. If this needs negotiation with your partner or family, now's the time to do it. Next, you need to be consistent. It's no use training really hard for 2 weeks and then doing nothing for the next 2 weeks, or only training on weekends. You should be doing some sort of training on at least 4 or better 5 days per week. So the good old expression, train hard to race easy. Of course, you're going to race hard as well, but it's comparatively speaking. Point 3, build a strong aerobic base. This is the single most important quality you need to develop. Unfortunately, there are no shortcuts to this. You need to spend a lot of time on your bike, mostly at low intensity, because otherwise you'll simply get too tired. This will create the endurance adaptations you need without adding that unnecessary fatigue. So I want to go into this in a bit more detail because it's often misunderstood. Why do we ride at low intensity? Surely if you want to ride faster, you should train faster. Well, it's not that simple. The key point is you get all the aerobic adaptations you need at low intensity, and making every ride as hard as you can is a very ineffective way to train because of all the extra fatigue, which means you're not going to train for so long. And you get more adaptations by training for longer. It'll work. Doing this will work when you first start cycling, but you'll soon hit a plateau. Now, if we look at the chart, most beginners and indeed many club cyclists train something like the blue bars on this chart, with most of their time spent riding quite hard in zones 3 and 4. But it's now been shown that it's more effective to do the majority of your training as shown by the red bars, at high volume and low intensity in zones 1 and 2, combined with a small amount at high intensity, zones 4, 5, 6. This is the way the professionals train. The ratio can be anywhere between 80-20 and 90-10. It's called polarized training. And as I say, all professional cyclists adopt a variant of this basic principle, mainly because it's impossible to train 20 or 30 hours a week at medium intensity. Most of your training has to be at low intensity when you're training so much. Okay, now there is a variant called pyramidal training, which means that you're still training mostly at low intensity, but instead of the extra 20% being all at high intensity, a good part of that is at medium intensity. So it might be something like 80, 15, 5. And that's a good way to train as you get closer and closer to the event, because the event itself you'll do most of the riding in the event itself will be in those middle zones. Now, to do polarized training right, you need to be clear on the zones. If you don't know what your zones are, or if your zones are wrong, then you won't be training effectively. So you only need 3. Here's a very simple 3-zone model. The most important zone boundary is between the moderate and heavy zones, which are called zone 1 and zone 2 in a 3-zone model. This boundary is called LT1, the first lactate threshold, or VT1, the first ventilatory threshold. And it's the point, it's not really a threshold because it's a continuum, but it's the point at which you can see the lactate concentration in your blood beginning to increase as you do more work. And you can see if you can see your breathing start to accelerate because you're needing more oxygen. You should do the majority of your training at or below this threshold. So how can you determine it? Well, the best way is with a lab test where they measure the lactate concentration in your blood while you increase the load by steps. But this is, however, obviously expensive and not always easy to find. So you can either buy your own portable lactate tester, um, but they're a bit tricky to use. So there's a steep learning curve, or estimate the threshold by paying very careful attention to your breathing during a step test on your turbo trainer, starting at a very easy load such as 80 watts or so, and increasing by 15 or 20 watts every 3 or 4 minutes. Note the power and heart rate at the time when your breathing starts to change. This indicates you're crossing this threshold area and are using more oxygen. The other test you can do is when you're out riding with a buddy, see whether you can talk entirely normally and conversationally without struggling to get the words out. If you can, then you're probably in the right zone. If you can't, then you're riding too hard. Now, the thing is, probably takes place at a much lower intensity than you think, or certainly than you hope. For most people, it's no more than 60 to 65% of their heart rate max or their FTP, and it may be lower still. Okay, so pay attention to that. Now, back to our list of general principles. The fourth principle is to develop your fat burning capacity. This probably also needs a bit of explanation to understand why it's important. During endurance exercise, our body has two possible sources for energy, basically glucose or fat. There are important differences between the two of them. The first issue is that your body can only store about 2,000 calories of energy in the form of glycogen, whereas it can store at least 50,000 in the form of fat. This means that, to draw the analogy with a car, we have an engine that can burn two different types of fuel, but we only have a small tank of one type of fuel while there's a huge tank of the other. Now, this wouldn't matter if the two types of fuel were totally interchangeable, but of course they're not. Basically, you need glucose to ride at high intensity. It cannot be fueled entirely by fat. Fat may or may not have a small contribution, but at high intensity, it's essentially glucose that's fueling your ride. So there's a huge advantage if you can burn a high percentage of fat at race pace, because then you're conserving the glycogen for the hardest efforts only. Someone who burns very little fat at race pace is forced to burn through their reserves of glycogen, and once they're gone, they're forced to slow down. As you can see from the chart, which was taken from a research study, even amongst well-trained athletes, which would include most people attempting to qualify for the world, the variations are huge, with fat oxidation ranging at rest. All these measurements were taken at rest, between 20% to almost 100%. So the people with the least ability to burn fat were only burning 20% at rest, whereas the best were essentially getting all their energy needs from fat. So it's a huge difference. The researchers found a similar distribution at race pace, but shifted towards less fat burning. The very best could only manage 40% fat burning, so the 60% was coming from glucose, and many were down to 0, so 100% was coming from glucose. Now, the good news is that this is trainable. I went into this in a lot more detail last year, so I recommend you watch our 2024 video on YouTube. The relevant section is from 30 minutes 35 seconds to 37 minutes 55 seconds. Back to our list. The fifth principle is to build your short-term muscular endurance. So long as you have good bike handling skills, this is the crucial quality you need to turn a good performance into an excellent one. This is because of the vital importance of positioning and drafting. It's your short-term muscular endurance that enables you to make the hard efforts to get to the front just before a climb or an intersection, to power up the short climbs, and to follow the right wheels at the right time. Okay, so it's really important. 6, in the last 3 or 4 weeks, you should be doing at least 2,600 meters in a single ride if you're preparing the Granfondo, and at least 2,000 meters in a single ride if you're preparing the Mediofondo. If you live in a flat area, your options are 1, to do hill repeats on whatever you can find nearby, 2, to travel to find some climbs, and 3, to use a smart trainer linked to an app which will simulate the climbs for you. Seventh principle is to increase the load progressively. If you're currently only training 5 hours a week and you want to increase this to 10 hours a week, for example, you should take probably a month to get there because your body needs the time to adapt to that increased training load. Next is the crucial importance of recovery. Never lose sight of the fact that your body only gets stronger when you rest and recover. Training breaks you down and creates the stimulus needed, but you only get stronger during recovery. It's really important to allow your body the time it needs for this process. Next, monitor monitor your readiness for high load. This is important because research over the last few years has shown that training hard only has a positive effect if your body is in a state to benefit from it. I'll go into this in more detail in a few minutes. And finally, last but not least, the 10th of our general principles is that you should include some exercises in your training to develop your technical skills, such as descending, cornering, group riding, putting on a jacket, taking it off, eating while you're riding, and that sort of thing. You're only going to get better at these through deliberate practice. So now we've talked about the general principles, let's take a look at the training plan framework. It includes 3 phases or periods. First one being preparation, where you prepare your body for an increased training load and develop your aerobic and fat-burning capacities. Second one is pre-competition, where you add training stress to sharpen yourself up for the actual event. And finally, the competition or taper period, where you reduce the fatigue without losing any fitness. So here you can see our framework training plan, which you can download from the Granfondo Vosges website under training plan, or just send me an email to request it. It's a framework, and it's not a detailed day-by-day training plan for the reasons I've already explained. The idea is that if you understand the reasoning and the rationale, you can design your own training plan that's perfectly tailored for you. So I'm not going to go through the plan in detail. Let me just highlight the structure. The first page we're looking at here tells you what to focus on during each period and why, and there's a second page with suggested workouts for each period. Each phase is broken down into 4-week cycles, including 3 load weeks and 1 recovery week, with a target training load for each week. If you're over 50, there's evidence that shows that adopting a 3-week cycle of 2 load weeks and 1 recovery week might be beneficial, because once we're over 50, it takes longer to recover. This is the second page with suggestions for workouts during high volume and low volume training weeks during each period. The more experienced you are and the harder you intend to race, the more you need to do in terms of intervals and high intensity. It should never be more than 2 sessions per week. So how do you take the framework and customize it for you? It's best to be pragmatic and start with your constraints, especially your training time availability. So be realistic, confirm it with your partner and family, and even your boss, if necessary. This could save a lot of misunderstandings and arguments. Which days of the week can you train, and for how long? What are the family or work commitments that will prevent you from training on certain days or weeks? Once you've thought this through, you can block off week by week the training time you will really have available. You'll probably end up with something that's a long way away from ideal, but that can't be helped. Unless you're retired and have got nothing else to do, you're going to have constraints. Adjust things as much as you can to respect the principle of increasing the training load followed by recovery in 3 or 4 week cycles. Now let's look at what should be in part 1 of your training plan. Part 1 then is the preparation phase, running basically from now until mid-February. The key objectives during this period are to build your training capacity, your ability to train for 10 to 12 hours or more per week, and to ride long distances without undue fatigue. 2, and really part as the first objective, the objective is to build fat burning capacity. So these first 2 are the 80 to 90%, and the 10 to 20% part is to build strength and neuromuscular capacity. This will also have the effect of pushing up your critical power FTP and help with durability, that ability to ride the last climbs as hard as the first climbs, assuming that you've paced yourself correctly. Finally, take every opportunity to include exercises to work on technical skills such as descending and cornering at speed. So those are the objectives and the focus. Now let's look at how to do it. So here's the plan for a typical loading week. There are no shortcuts to build training capacity and aerobic endurance. You need to progress to 4, then 5-hour rides at low intensity. don't succumb to the temptation to push harder. Remember, these rides are supposed to feel slow. These long, slow rides will also help you burn more fat, but only if you adapt your diet, as I explained last year. So the key point is to measure the rides in time and not in kilometers. If you set yourself the objective of riding 80 kilometers or 100 kilometers, you're going to ride that faster than if you set yourself the target of riding for 4 hours or 5 hours. Okay, it's inevitable. So set the target in hours, not distance. The second training session of the week should be an interval session. This is part of the 10-20% that should be focused on high intensity. When it comes to the race, you'll be doing the climbs at or close to your critical power or FTP, and you'll be making plenty of shorter efforts above threshold to move up in the group, close gaps, and so on. So these interval sessions are really about three things. One is pulling your FTP higher, the second is about increasing durability, and the third is about increasing your pain tolerance. Okay, I'm repeating all this because the more you understand why you're doing it, the more likely you are to do it and to get benefit from it. So we'll look at the details on the next slide. First, let me tell you that the third session should be another long, low-intensity ride. So these are the first three priorities. One long ride, two intervals, three, another long ride, and then four, another interval session. Okay, so let's look now at the intervals we recommend. We could discuss forever on which are the best interval sessions, but apart from the obvious that they should be aligned at least to some extent on an effort that you can expect during the race, the research so far hasn't identified a magic bullet for intervals. The ones I'm showing you here are 2 by 10-minute blocks with 5 minutes easy between. Second lot are 4 by 8-minute blocks with 3 minutes easy between, and then 8 by 4 minutes with 2 minutes easy between. The intensity is different in each case. All of these will definitely work, but if you tell me that you prefer something slightly different, I'm not going to argue. Without being your coach, I can't give you a precise intensity to train at because I just don't know you. So choose the intensity so that you can complete the session with something in reserve. If you've got a lot of experience with intervals and you're regularly doing them, then you'll know what works for you. So keep doing what works for you. If you haven't done any intervals for a while, I suggest starting at sweet spot or even tempo, so quite a bit below your FTP. Over a 46-week period, you can work up to higher intensities and you can add duration as well, add extra intervals or add extra time. The other question is on the cadence. My suggestion is to vary the cadence between sessions, but probably not during a session, at least at this time of year. Assuming you're doing 2 per week, you could do one session at high cadence and the other at low cadence. So what does this mean? It depends on you, but high would be above 80 RPM and low would be below 60 RPM. Be aware that at any given power, it will feel harder at high cadence and your heart rate will be higher. Be very careful at any cadence below about 55 because it puts a lot of strain on your lower back and knees, so it's easy to injure yourself. A few things to remember: warm up very well before the first interval, at least 15 minutes, and really 20 to 30 is better. Remember that these are as much about pain tolerance as anything else, so they're supposed to hurt. However, it's not a good idea, at least during this phase, to completely empty the tank. It's better to stop with one interval left in reserve. So if you're going to do 2 interval sessions a week, it's absolutely essential that the long rides are at low intensity. Otherwise, your training load will be too high and you'll sooner or later end up in a bad place. So remember that hard training creates the stimulus to get stronger, but your body only actually rebuilds and gets stronger when you give it the chance to recover. So only do a 5th training ride, even a recovery ride, if you're really feeling good and all indicators are green. But even then, keep it to a maximum of 1 hour and at very low intensity. Okay, so that's it for a typical load week. For a recovery week, drop the intervals and do about half the volume at low intensity. Rest and recover. A brief word about nutrition strategy, and then we'll look in detail at stress management and recovery. There are 3 important objectives concerning nutrition. The first is to fuel your training load so that you're eating exactly what you need, but no more. The second is to optimize your ability to burn fat. Remember, this is essential in order to conserve glycogen for the last half of the race at the Granfondo Vosges. And the third is to achieve your desired weight, which may or may not mean losing a few kilograms, or more rarely, adding muscle. So achieving these three objectives together means you need to adjust your total calories consumed to be equivalent or slightly below the calories you're burning, while adjusting the relative amount of carbs and fats you eat to correspond to your training load. The basic idea is to train your body to use fat for its base load and low intensity training, and only use carbs when you need them at high intensity. Again, I went into this at length in last year's presentation, so you can review it on YouTube. Now we come to recovery. The key point of training is obviously to obtain an adaptation. Unfortunately, training load doesn't automatically result in adaptation. In fact, for the same training, the adaptation you get depends on what happens when you're not training. Strange, but true. There are plenty of studies which show this. In one study carried out by Alan Couzens, an American coach, elite swimmers with higher life stress had a higher incidence of injury or illness and a significantly lower performance improvement over the season compared to those with lower life stress. Furthermore, the swimmers who had the top 15% of life stress ratings showed no improvement in performance for the season, despite putting in exactly the same training as the low stress group, and in some got worse. So imagine that, training for the whole season with no improvement or even getting worse. And it was due to their high stress in their lives outside of the training. Plenty more studies show that recovery and adaptation is inhibited by stress, training stress, or life stress, or both. All of this stress forces your body to secrete various hormones that are needed to manage the stress, but which also inhibit your training recovery. So what this means is that when you're highly stressed, you should only train at low intensity, if at all, just to maintain your fitness. Don't do any high intensity or even high volume, and don't expect any real improvement until your stress comes back to normal. So what do we mean by stress? To your central nervous system, all stress is the same. It doesn't matter if it's an acute stressor like hard training, traveling, intercontinental, illness, a short-term illness, a flu or something, an evening of heavy drinking, a short-term problem at work or at home, or a chronic stressor like overtraining, like chronic disease that hangs on for weeks, long COVID, for example, long-term challenges at work, financial worries, relationship difficulties, any of these things which are just stress you for a long period. The result is the same. You're in a constant state of fight or flight, and your central nervous system is in a sympathetic state, where what you want is for the central nervous system to be in a parasympathetic state, which is rest and repair, not fight or flight. Fortunately, there's an easy way to measure your current level of total stress. You don't need to test for the hormones, but just for their effect on your heart rate, and especially your heart rate variability, your HRV. The best way to do this is to install the HRV4 training app on your telephone and then measure your heart rate variability every morning. For the measure to be valid, it must be in strictly the same conditions. Just after waking up in a seated position, it only takes 1 minute. Do not rely on an overnight reading from your Apple Watch, your Fitbit, your Whoop or Oura Ring or anything else you may have. For reasons too complicated to go into here, these readings are useless for the purpose of measuring your readiness to train hard. Okay, after a week, the app will report your normal range. On the example here, you can see on the right, you can see the daily readings, the 7-day moving average, which is the white line, and the normal range, which is the gray area. So in this case, all was good until the 20th of May, the one from last reading, which is yellow there, you can see, when the reading was well below the normal range. So all I did was I took a day off on that day, didn't train at all, and the next day it had recovered, so I was back to training normally. So the point is, as long as you're heart rate variability is normal, all is good. You train as per your plan. If your heart rate variability is outside the normal range, whether it's too high or too low, you should only train easy or even not at all. It's a bit technical and it may not be totally clear why this is important, but so for more on this, check out our video on our YouTube channel, or if you prefer reading, you can find a blog article on the Alpine Cols website. Or also, you can also do an internet search, you'll find plenty of stuff. We know this works because numerous research studies have looked at the relationship between heart rate variability and training response. For example, one of the most dramatic ones measured the difference in training response after 24 sessions of moderate intensity training for two groups, one with high heart rate variability, which is good, and a second with low heart rate variability, which is bad. They found the high HRV group got 20 times the benefit for a given training load. 20 times. They're absolutely astonishing. So it's worth paying attention to. So if too much stress means you can't recover and adapt, what can you do to decrease your stress and therefore increase your HRV? So let's start with a list of things to avoid. It's mostly common sense. You probably know most, if not all of this. Obviously, avoid repeated poor sleep. Do what you need to do to make sure you're sleeping well. Get to bed early, regularly, always at the same time, with little alcohol in your system. Don't go to bed with your phone looking at social media and so on and so forth. Avoid extended desk time, by which I mean sitting at your desk for hours and hours on end without getting up. Avoid as much as you can conflict and noise. If you have to be in a noisy area, then wear ear defenders or noise cancelling headphones. Avoid bad, heavily industrialized or excessive food. Avoid as much as you can social media, doom scrolling and all of that good stuff, and television, and be wary of very intense training. Avoid overtraining because that's a source of stress as well. And now a list of things to do more of. Yoga, meditation are great practices which will reduce your stress and increase your HRV. If you don't want to do that, at least practice slow, deep breathing. You don't need to do it for very long, but it's a great practice, and if you measure your HRV before and after, you will see the impact immediately. It just reduces your stress and puts your central nervous system in a parasympathetic state. Quiet time in nature, go walking in the woods or in a garden or anywhere that's natural. Eat obviously good, nourishing food, best quality stuff you can get hold of. Listen to relaxing music more than doom scrolling on social media, and do as much easy movement as you can throughout the day. So mostly common sense. The more you do of the stuff on the right, the less stress you will, or the more you'll manage your stress, the more you'll bring it down and be able to train hard. Okay, we're almost finished, but before we do, we still have to mention an unpopular subject, which is that if you want to ride fast and hard, you're going to have to push harder on the pedals, which means stronger muscles. And sadly for us cyclists, the best way to strengthen your muscles is off the bike. Even low cadence, high torque intervals won't help much. So to develop leg and core strength, you should plan on 1 or 2 sessions per week, ideally guided by a strength and conditioning coach with experience in cycling. The goal at this time of year is to increase the strength of your leg and core muscles. If you're new to this, err on the side of caution to limit the risk of injury. The most basic exercises are squats, lunges, planks, bridges, bicycle kicks, roll downs, and all that sort of stuff. But there are many more which are beneficial. The key is to learn the proper technique, again, to avoid injury. Next is mobility and flexibility. Stretching is a good part of that. You should be doing 2 to 3 15 to 20-minute sessions per week. Pilates or yoga can be extremely beneficial, one or the other. And again, learning correct technique is vital. So choose a practitioner who knows cycling and only takes small groups, or better still, individuals. Be careful of stretching too hard yourself. If you don't know really what you're doing, you can injure yourself. Personal experience speaking here. Complement occasionally with other sports. running, swimming, walking, and so on and so forth. If cycling is your only sport, you risk building up imbalances and soft tissue problems over time. So I know a lot of people are going to ignore this slide. I strongly suggest you don't. I myself would have ignored it 20 years ago, and I regret now that I did. You're much better off if you keep things in balance. So that's it. I've given you the guidelines that should allow you to prepare yourself well between now and mid-February. Rendezvous then to see how things have gone and to talk about part 2, the pre-competition period. In the meantime, it's up to you. Create your own custom training plan from what I've given you, and then follow it. If you'd like professional help to be at your absolute best for the event, we can help you in 2 different ways. The first is to join one of our coaching camps for a big block of training before the event, as well as for one-on-one coaching on your technical skills. The first one of those is in the Canary Islands in January. And then there's a second opportunity in April in Corsica, which is about 3 weeks or so before, good 3 weeks before the Granfondo Vosges, so good timing for a decent block. Of course, if you don't have the time to customize your own plan, we can do it for you. Sign up for a coaching agreement, and you'll get a custom plan updated as often as necessary, and plenty of one-to-one advice. So thank you very much for listening, and good luck.